I was just sitting here thinking, and it occurred to me that this was never what I had in mind. This was never part of the plan. When Stacia and I moved to New York 20 years ago, I had every intention of settling into the role of an antiquarian bookshop proprietor and becoming a bookman of the first order. And I'd set up my small bindery and repair volumes damaged by time or mishandling, and essentially help preserve the words of our intellectual and literary antecedents. I mean, it was going to be a slow-paced, retiring lifestyle surrounded by people who loved words and the smell of book leather. But as Thomas à Kempis wrote in his masterpiece, The Imitation of Christ, man proposes, but God disposes. And we are foolish indeed if we believe that as Christians, having dedicated our lives to Christ, He will decline to become involved. God has a plan for each one of us, and it may not be what we think. I mean, I've mentioned before that God speaks to us all the time, in a lovely work of art, in a stirring musical work, through random thoughts that plague our hearts, through conscience, or simply in the words of people around us. God began preparing me for His service when I was a child. I didn't realize it. He gave me an inquiring mind and a love of reading. He gave me an extroverted personality and a sense of humor. And He gave me a loving Christian family and a safe, nurturing home. In return, I gave Him nothing but grief. Questioning, arguing with teachers, creating my own views of the nature of the universe, traveling the paths of profound doubt and agnosticism, until one day I realized that the incarnation of a deity was not an unreasonable idea, and that perhaps the record of that required another perusal. Well, during my years of seeking and exploring, the church itself, through the words of Deacon Millie Williams, expressed God's call to me. One day she just looked at me and said, "Gary, I think you should become a deacon." Now, it's not my intention to provide testimony. I share this with you simply as an example of how God speaks to us. I mean, I never doubted for a moment that Millie's words were directly from God. I wanted to doubt it because becoming a deacon was not what I had planned. Nevertheless, I chose to listen to God's call. And 5 years later, in faithfulness to God's call, I was ordained a deacon. But mine is not a special case. As I said, God calls each of us, perhaps not to holy orders or to some grand mission field, but God does call us to a holy life, a life of service, and an attitude of love and forbearance. God called Samuel in today's Old Testament reading. 3 times He called him, and each time Samuel ran to Eli, who was sleeping in the next room, and said, "Here I am." But Eli was not the one who called. God had a task for Samuel, a mission, if you will. And Samuel, hearing the call, ran to where he thought he should be. He did not recognize the call of God, So he instead interpreted it as something else. He knew he was wanted for something, but it certainly couldn't be important. I mean, after all, he was just a boy in training to become a Nazirite, a boy who helped the old blind priest, an acolyte and servants of sorts. In the grand scheme of things, Samuel was pretty much a nobody. But Eli realized that God was speaking to the boy. And he told Samuel what to do and say when God called again. And when God called again, because God is persistent in wanting to be in touch with us, when God called again, Samuel said, "Speak, Lord, for thy servant hears." It's really a beautiful story of connecting with God. But it's also a cautionary tale about refusing God's will. If we read on in the story of Eli, we find that his two sons who were priests of the people, used their position to take advantage of those same people. And Eli let them do it. It did not end well for any of them. But Samuel connected with God and became a great prophet in Israel, and the last of the judges. It was Samuel who anointed both Saul and David as kings of Israel, and all while heeding God's direction. And likewise, for great things to happen in our world today, we too must heed God's direction and do what God would have us do. But first we must hear God's word. We must hear God's call and realize that God is calling us. God is calling us simple nobodies because he knows how much we can accomplish together. He and us together. But hearing God's call and recognizing it are different things. Like Samuel, we might hear God calling us, but think it is something else. We hear his call and we think it's a call to wealth or fame or leisure or bookbinding, because that's what we want it to be. That's what we have planned. So that's where we run. We brush aside God's call because we're too young or too old or too busy, or because we're just working through some stuff right now. And there are plenty of reasons we can find for postponing God's plan for us. But they all simply boil down to believing that our plan is more important than God's plan. If we're Christians, real Christians, the type that realizes that making a commitment to Christ is a life-defining undertaking from which there is no turning away, then we will know that accepting the call of God through Christ will require more than we ever planned to give, and the willingness to sacrifice whatever we thought we were going to be. I do not regret following God's call, nor do I resent him for making it. How could I? God is not thoughtless in his call. He does not randomly assign jobs like handing out so many chores. God knows each of us intimately, and the work he plans for us is suited to us. In my case, I suspect what he wanted was an old bookman with a love of words, who desired to preserve what had come before, and who saw the potential in reclaiming things damaged by time or mishandling. So after all these years, God has me doing pretty much what I had planned. Just not how I planned to be doing it. And God has a plan for you as well. If you'll only open yourself to his call and respond, "Speak, Lord, for thy servant hears." And for that, thanks be to God.